All right, that was a track called Intra by Shubh Saran on his album English. That's with an I. It starts with an I. And I just want to say, as soon as I heard this album, I was just like blown away. So I'm super, super happy to be able to shine a light on Shubh's music. Shubh, thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Man, I got to tell you, I don't know what you're doing. Like, I get what's happening musically, but I listen to it and I'm like, where is all of this coming from? There's just like a wellspring of joy and beauty and art and culture. I feel like you have the complete package, man. I just absolutely love all of your music that I've heard so far.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah, a couple of people have said like, tell me about this guy. You know, I'm like, I've been listening to this album like nonstop, and they're like, oh, what is it? I said, it's like Avishai Cohen, but without trying. You know? Like
Nice. Oh wow.
Avishai's music sounds like, okay, we're gonna try to do something really complex or interesting, or with this particular flavor. Yours just feels so effortless and natural, and I want to know all about like where did you come from and how did this music happen?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's actually, I'd say, probably the biggest compliment because I have this. I think musicians have a hard relationship with complexity, like wanting to write things that are hard, but also, forcing complexity never. I don't know. It's never a recipe for. I think great, honest music. So I've really tried to be like as honest with myself and like my writing process, just with writing music. And like sometimes, the best things are when you like don't realize it's hard and you like analyze it later. You're like, oh, I guess that's like a bar of like something, and there's in this meter I didn't even realize. But when you realize when you're like programming it into logic or writing a chart for something. So those are the kind of best moments where the complex things just happen. So thank you. That's great.
This album has everything that I think our audience would listen for or love. You've got polyrhythms, you've got
We do.
you've got tuplets everywhere, quintuplets and septuplets.
Yeah.
But it's not like you're forcing any of it. And I don't know if it's because your album cover, you just look like someone surprised you with the photos. Like,
Yeah. It's actually a sheet music for a song I wrote, and I was like, that's what it was.
nevertheless, like you just even watching on your YouTube channel, there are these live performances of your music. You're just having fun, and it doesn't look like anybody is stressed or having a hard time, even though this is not easy music. It's deceptive. And I'd like to hear how does your band jump in and play some of this stuff? Does it require a lot of rehearsal, or is it just as effortless as it sounds?
It's actually fairly straightforward. It doesn't require a ton of shedding, but I think I'm very lucky because my band like rehearses before on their own, so they'll like practice the music, shed it, and then we'll come together and practice a couple of times before a show. But I do think that like it is complex when you analyze it, but it is, I think, really driven by like grooves and melody, and those things are easy to grab onto. And I think regardless of how subdivided something is or how many meter changes there are, if there's a strong through line of a melody or a drum groove, it's easy just to go by feel and by ear. So I'm rarely thinking about, or not really, I'm never thinking about the meter when I'm playing this stuff, and just thinking about um, the melodic stuff or the rhythmic stuff that's like popping out and latching onto that.
And I love that because melody to me is sort of the pinnacle of music. I
Yeah.
love things like the Dixie Dregs. I love animals as leaders, but try whistling one of their songs. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it just doesn't work. Like you can hear it in your head, but you can't really express it yourself. But
Right.
all of your music is expressible. You can hum along with it, whistle, sing it, whatever. And I love that you have such strong melodies. Do you start with a melody, or do you write everything else and then figure out what goes on top of it?
Yeah, usually it's sometimes it's like secondary. The first thing is usually like a guitar part. It's either like the guitar riff, the keyboard part that was the guitar riff, or some guitar thing, like the song you just played, Intra. That little main riff melody was a guitar part, and then playing it up the octave and rearranging it, you kind of like squeeze a melody out of it. And then sometimes a melody just is just like a, you know, kind of beautiful layer that goes on top of everything. But it is secondary sometimes, which is I think why it allows it to be like this floaty, almost ambient thing that just pulls everything together. Yeah.
Yeah, so tell people a little about yourself. You're in Brooklyn, Berkeley grad, but like, where are you from? What do you listen to? And just anything
Yeah.
you care to share.
Yeah, so where I'm from is like a it's not an easy answer. I wish it was. It's like it's not a one word answer. So I'm from India. I'm from Delhi, but I didn't grow up in India. I spent when I was really young, and then high school for India. But before and after, I was outside. Grew up around the world. So my parents worked for the government. They traveled a lot, so we would move every 3 years. So I used to live in Egypt when I was a kid, and then Switzerland after that. And then I moved to. I was born in Bangladesh, um, lived in Canada for a bit, and then finally made my way to Boston for Berkeley. Then moved to Brooklyn, and I've been here since Berkeley. This is actually the place I've lived in the longest is Brooklyn, ironically enough. But I am an Indian citizen. My parents live in Delhi, so I go back every year or every 2 years. Feel very Indian, but culturally all over the place. That was sort of the impetus for English, the whole record actually. um, was dealing with my identity as a ethnically Indian person, but culturally kind of not, 100%. Um, and what am I listening to? I kind of, grew up playing punk rock and punk pop music like a kid from the 90s, early 2000s. And then, got really into like, I guess you could call it like blues pop, like John Mayer and all those like singers who kind of around in the early 2000s. And then Berkeley was a big like deep dive into jazz, modern jazz. Ended up really falling in love with modern jazz, and then kind of have pursued that path for a while, and now it's kind of all over the place, getting really into just like progressive rock music, like modern prog music, a lot of metal, and then fusion and things like that. But I also have this other side of me. I really love just sad indie music. Like huge fan of like Bon Iver, Novo More, Maro, stuff like that. Like very vocal heavy, just indie music. Also, I love. So, yeah.
You used a couple of four-letter words in that answer, prog and jazz.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
Jazz, like one thing that bothers me about jazz, and I think there's plenty to say about jazz. Pat Metheny has done many discourses about the word jazz, but whereas I feel like there's a lot of people who are like, let's make jazz that sounds like Indian music.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
you are just expressing yourself musically, and I think we call that jazz, or at least like we hear what sounds enough like jazz. But I think you said before we went live, you don't think of yourself as a jazz artist. That's not how you label your music. And
Yeah.
as technically you're not coming from Western, a Western mindset, and you're not thinking about music in the same way that we were talking earlier. Like, I'm going to do something that complex, or I'm going to write something in this time signature or this key, whatever. Could you talk a little about sort of with your global background and your encounters and enjoyment of Western music? How do you blend these things, and is there anything distinctly like not non-Western that you have to sort of conform to make things work in something like Logic?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, to a certain degree, yes. I mean, I think my musical upbringing has, by and large, been Western. So I, listened to music of the time and music of the day, which was basically like American, some European rock music. And then obviously jazz and R&B and stuff like that. I play the guitar, so like just the nature of the instrument lends itself to a particular culture or a particular region of cultures of music. Um, But underneath all of that that was happening when I was growing up, there was a lot of just like Indian classical music at home and Indian fusion, what we call Indian fusion music, which is Indian music blended with like rock and pop and stuff, but made in India, happening in India, and like Bollywood music always also is huge for any Indian household. So that was always kind of been happening in the background. I never studied Indian music formally, just kind of grew up listening to it. So a lot of the Indian information I have in my music is just pieced together from just, I think, just growing up. I did study Western, so I studied jazz. So that part of my education has been very formal, like music education, college education. But the Indian stuff has just been kind of just piecemeal and what I like and what I don't like. So I think that's why it feels effortless, because a lot of it is just me super intuitively making melodies that to me sound pretty, and they end up sounding Indian or Indian inspired or Middle Eastern, but only because it's like those kind of melodies I think resonate in your being a little more because they come with like tradition and family and your perception of culture and stuff. The Western stuff is just a lot of it is analysis based and formal, and so I think that's why it feels more seamless for me, because like when I hear a beautiful melody, it just has inflections and gamakas and stuff that it just like in my head it just has those things. So I think that's why it feels like it blends together a little better, because I'm not really thinking about it too much.
Cool. All right. Well, let's take a listen to. I was going to play the other, but I know Post Tradition. It's your most popular track, I think, based on views and listen counts. So let's listen to Post Tradition, and I'll decide on Ring Hunting or the other for the closer.
Sweet. Cool.
I had the volume down. Gonna fix that. All right, that was a track called Post Tradition. It's the third track on the album English, on Shubh's album. So I love that track. It's just got such a great groove. It's really interesting. What can you tell us about that one?
That one, it's kind of based off of. It was like the last one I wrote for the album. Very much was like a throwaway song. Ended up finishing it, and I was like, oh, actually, this should probably just be the single. But it was like based around this arpeggiator pattern that just kind of goes through basically the whole song,
Hmm.
except like one small portion. And it was just this melody, this like guitar riff that is kind of buried under the layers of melodies and stuff. But this like kind of rock sounding riff. It was very much like it sounds like a pop punk '90s rock riff if you hear it on its own. And then over that, like I was saying, as I was building the song up, the only melody I was hearing was this like this kind of very like runny, slidey melody that just kind of ends up coming out sounding Indian, Middle Eastern,
Hmm.
and yeah, that was the thing for it. And like, what I tried to do on this record was try to like be very conscious about making, you know, the A section, the B section, not just repetitive forms of like A is not a repeated A. Like the first A is distinctly different from the second A. So the melody actually is different each time it comes around, just very ever so slightly. And that was a conscious effort for I think most of the like verse chorus kind of form through this whole record. So this song actually was my favorite ones where it was like, oh, you don't really know the melody's changing every go around, but it is slightly, and so it keeps it very fresh. And like each time you listen to it, there's a little bit that you can kind of like grab onto and relearn each time, which is nice. So that was this post tradition. Um, it was about what I was mentioning, just growing up, and we were talking about jazz before we went live. This notion of like tradition, what our traditions are like. I question my tradition constantly because I didn't. Again, I was saying I didn't study Indian classical music growing up. I also didn't grow up listening to jazz. I learned it later on in life, so I didn't come from a long tradition of jazz or Indian music. It was kind of just piecemeal things that I grabbed onto through different moments of my life. And so when I ask myself what my musical tradition or musical heritage is, I don't know if I necessarily have one. And so the song is kind of, and the whole record, but the song especially is kind of questioning like, well, are we losing our traditions? Is there a generation of people who are just losing tradition, or are we just creating new ones for ourselves? And I think it's the latter. But it is you know, it's a tough thing to think about. And that's kind of what the song is about.
Well, and that's something that's interesting about music too. Like, we don't want to be stuck
Yeah.
repeating what's been done over and over again.
Right.
Traditions are wonderful, in a sense that it's often an annual thing or something that happens seasonally. There's a cyclical nature where each time it's different, but like music, I feel like is not meant to be that.
I
you
think
know,
so. Yeah. I
especially
think
recorded music.
right. Right. I think it's the job of any artist, I think, to pushing limits and pushing boundaries a little bit is inherent in the job description. However, the other side of it is that there's a strong part of our jobs and lives is to pay homage to things that came before us. I think like whether it's implicit or explicit, carrying something forward, whatever that something is also part of being a musician and an artist. But if you don't know what that thing is that you're carrying forward, it can get kind of tricky. And carrying something forward for the sake of care, like if I were to say I'm carrying the tradition of jazz forward, I don't necessarily think I'm doing a great job because there's someone like I didn't grow up with you know uh, traditional jazz from the 50s and 60s. I stepped into it in the 90s and 2000s, so I'm not the true carrier of a certain style of music, nor can I say I'm carrying Indian music forward because I also didn't spend my life growing up in a gharana learning from a guru. So both those things, it's a tough thing where I do think music needs to be pushed and traditions need to be questioned, but at the same time there is also a large part of being a musician which is just paying respect to things before you. So I always grapple with that. That's a very difficult thing for me to figure out.
Pretty deep stuff. Tell me about, how did Ground Up Music discover you? How'd you end up on their label?
Oh, I don't think I am on their label.
Oh, I thought that you were on their YouTube channel like several times.
Oh, really? No, I don't think
Maybe
so.
not. Okay, my mistake. I must have
But yeah, no,
misattribution.
but I'm just a big fan. So
Oh, okay. Yeah, because like I think I was doing a bunch of research on like the best of 2022 music that I liked.
oh, I see.
And I was looking at Becca Stevens, who's on there, and there's another House of Waters, who's on there, and I could have sworn you were also on the channel, but
Oh wow.
I guess not.
I'm, I'm
Sorry.
not, and if I am, that's awesome. I don't think I am. I'm unsigned. I'm like independent.
Oh,
I had
cool, cool.
since the first record I made. Yeah,
All
I
right,
was on the label for the first record, and then since then I've just been independent.
good for you. So, where do people buy your stuff? How do we support you?
On Bandcamp,
Mm,
Shubh Saran, but also streaming services, Apple Music, Spotify,
mm,
all the regular places you would find music. I'm on there posting incessantly about my music.
excellent. And I wanted to buy a copy of your album for someone on the stream, but YouTube is like getting all buggy and showing that this video is upcoming and not
Oh,
live.
weird.
Yeah, so I will figure out a way to get your album to some people, but
Wow.
I'll
Thank
probably
you.
buy a couple of CDs. Do you have CDs?
Not of English.
Uh,
I think all. I had a limited amount of CDs with the first record. I think they're all sold out.
okay.
So, no.
Well, I will figure out a way to get some people some of
Yeah.
your music. We'll make that happen.
Thanks. But Bandcamp digitally, it's all available.
Okay, cool, cool. All right, yeah. So we've got Shub's Bandcamp URL is right down here in the lower right corner, and then you can follow him on Instagram here in the lower left-hand corner. It's just
Beautiful.
his full name on Instagram. Man, I feel like just so many things. We ran into so many difficulties yesterday, and then today.
Yeah. It's smooth sailing. So
I'm just glad it's working out. So thank
I
you
don't
again for joining, and
know.
really appreciate you taking the time. And your music is really, really fantastic.
Thank you, man. Thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah, so I want to close with Ring Hunting, which is, I think anyone who listens to like modern prog rock is gonna go, what is this? So
Nice.
pretty wild track. Anything you want to say before we go listen to it?
It's about a style of hunting tigers, which was kind of, I guess, brought through the generations of Indian history, but practiced heavily during colonized India. And they would encircle tigers in a circle of elephants and hunt them, kind of like shooting fish in a barrel.
Wow.
I just found that metaphor for the way people, I think, misuse cultural traditions and stuff. And I basically, found that fascinating. So I wrote a song called Ring Hunting. It's an angry and also pretty song at the same time, I think.
Yeah. Cool. And Sharon Baker, thank you so much for all your moderation and help with links and stuff. Really appreciate it. All right, here we go.